Biostatistics Unit seminar. We're delighted to have with us today Glen Martin from the University of Manchester. So Glen is a senior lecturer in health data science in the Centre for Health Informatics. And his current research interests include developing statistical methodology to support the development, validation and implementation of clinical prediction models, particularly interested in penalisation methods, missing data, evidence synthesis and multi-outcome risk prediction models. So his talk today is going to cover recent work that he's been doing in each of these areas, and I look forward to hearing more about it. Thank you, Glen.
Thanks, Jessica, and hi everyone. So as Jessica says, I'm Glen. It's an absolute delight to be able to be here and be able to talk to you this afternoon. So thanks, Jessica, for the invite. So as Jessica said, I'm going to talk about some of our recent methodological work in the field of risk prediction, specifically focusing on these 5 areas of, that are particularly interesting to me. So for each of the different sections of my talk, I'll overview the work and maybe outline some future directions in each of the different spaces. And I particularly welcome conversations with any of you on any of the areas that are of interest to you as a group as well. So before we get into all those topics, then I guess it's useful just to take a step back and just define exactly what I mean by a prediction model, or a CPM, as I'll refer to them. So many of you are probably aware of this already, but CPMs are essentially any statistical model or machine learning algorithm that takes a collection of characteristics about a patient as inputs and outputs the risk of some event happening either in a diagnostic setting or a prognostic setting. So you can see on the slide here an example of such a model. So this is just a screenshot from the Q-risk algorithm. So you can see all of the different covariates or predictor variables on the left-hand side of the app. You enter all the information, click calculate risk. Under the bonnet is a Cox proportional hazards model, and it outputs the 10-year risk of CVD on the right-hand side. And it's essentially all risk prediction models are based on this concept of using these covariates to output that risk of the outcome, whatever that may be. And these types of models have received large attention in both the statistical and clinical literature in recent years, primarily because they have a multitude of uses. So I'm outlining here just 3 different examples of how we might use such a model. So it could be for case mix adjustment for audit purposes. So in other words, if we're wanting to compare the performance of different hospitals, for example, we can use the risk prediction model to essentially adjust for different covariate patterns or case mix that each hospital might see to enable fair comparison of the outcomes. We might also use the prediction model for clinical decision making. So Q-risk is actually an example of that. So the Q-risk model is recommended in national health guidelines and NICE guidelines, in the sense that anyone with a Q-risk over 10% is recommended to be prescribed a statin. So in other words, the prediction model is enabling that clinical decision making on an individual patient level. And finally, we might use the prediction model for planning or forecasting. So you can imagine a situation where, for example, we might have an intensive care unit and we're trying to predict bed occupancy through that unit through time in such a way that we can plan our resources. And there are many other different uses of such a model. Now that actually leads quite nicely into the first topic that I want to talk about today, which is essentially how do we utilize existing prediction models that might be available in the literature. And the reason that's of interest to me is that despite those many uses that I've outlined, that the current way in which we develop and implement these types of models is really inefficient. And what I mean by that is, once a model has been identified as being required, different analysts or analytical teams might go ahead and obtain or collect data relevant to that prediction task. And they would go ahead and maybe develop and internally validate that model. And they might then ultimately go on to publish a paper saying that describes that development and initial validation. What then might happen is that a different research team might see that model and think, okay, well, I'm now at a different point in time, or maybe the model was developed in the UK and I want to see whether it works in a different country, for example. And so they take that published model, apply it to their data that might be of interest in their local population, and again, evaluate the predicted performance of that model. And what we commonly see is that the performance of that model drops, either through temporal validation or geographical validation. And then what will commonly happen is people will go, okay, well, the model doesn't work in my setting, so I'll reject that existing model or collection of existing models, and I'll start from scratch. And so we enter this loop of constantly developing and validating models, every time ignoring all of the existing evidence that's gone before it. So, for example, if any of you did a PubMed search, for example, of a prediction model and then insert a relevant clinical setting, you would absolutely be swamped with returns on that search strategy. There's literally hundreds of models that are developed across the literature. So an area of my work that's spanned from my PhD actually is to essentially change that viewpoint in such a way that it breaks the chain of this cycle of constantly disregarding the existing models. So what I mean by that is that once you've transferred an existing model through time or space, you use both the patient level data that you have at hand in the new setting and the existing models, and both of those feed into the development of the new model. So you're utilizing that existing evidence. And this is not actually a new concept in prediction modeling. So these papers here are a collection of examples that show methodologically how you can take an existing or previously published prediction model and apply what they call model updating methods that essentially tweak that existing model to more closely reflect the population of interest. So for example, let's say that we have an existing model, we're in a different geographical location, and we find that existing model systematically over or under predicts risk. So what we could do is we could apply some of these model updating techniques, which essentially, in that case, could update the intercept if it was a logistic regression model, for example, or they could re-estimate the baseline hazard in such a way that the predictions are more accurate and tailored to that local setting. Now, where this gets interesting for me is that each of these methods focus on a single model. Okay, they apply these model updating techniques to a single previously published CPM. But obviously, as I said, there are hundreds of models for any given clinical context, and so wouldn't it be nice if we could utilize all of those models that might be relevant for our prediction task? And so this is a collection of papers that essentially try and do that. So Thomas de Bray and colleagues in the Netherlands proposed a couple of different ways in which you could do this. So one is what people might naturally think when we talk about combining evidence. So meta-analysis, applying meta-analysis to this type of prediction context. So in other words, you have a set of published beta coefficients or log odds ratios, for example, from an existing logistic regression, and you apply two-stage meta-analysis across those coefficients to pull them together into a single model. Okay, so you're utilizing all of that prior evidence and modeling. Thomas also outlined a way that you could then combine that with, if you had local data available. So they provided a way of using what they call stack regression, whereby essentially put the linear predictors of each of the existing prediction models as covariates in the new model. And it provides essentially a weighted sum of all of the previously published prediction models applied in that local setting. So that's described on the left-hand paper there for those that are interested. So a few years ago now, myself and colleagues at Manchester essentially proposed a way of combining the left-hand paper with some of those papers from the previous slides, such that you could both combine the existing models and apply the model updating methods to them, such that you can then tweak the resulting meta model or an aggregate model to the local setting, okay, to try and get the most accurate predictions you can in that local setting, while also utilizing that available evidence. I guess the natural question that people might ask then is, well, when do we do this? Okay, should we do this in all settings, this utilizing existing models? Or are there instances where it's okay to just start from scratch? So this paper essentially tried to analyze, investigate that question. So we designed a simulation study such that we mimicked a situation where we had multiple different countries, say, where each of those countries develop a prediction model. And then we had a new country that then wanted to say, well, can I either develop a new model from scratch or utilize those existing models, okay, using a variety of different aggregation techniques. So the plot on the top right of this slide shows some of the results from that simulation study. So each panel here, the sigmas, are representing increasing heterogeneity between those different countries or populations. Okay, so as sigma increases, the covariate outcome associations across each of the countries is becoming increasingly different, and vice versa for smaller sigma. On the y-axis there, we've got calibration slope, which for anyone that doesn't know, this is an assessment of overfitting, where essentially what you want is a calibration slope of 1, and anything less than 1 indicates overfitting. And then on the x-axis, we have the size of the data set that was available to develop the new model, so the size of data available in this new country. And so what we were finding is that, so the purple dots and the yellow dots here are two methods to essentially develop a new model in each panel, whereas the red and the green are essentially two different aggregation methods, so combining the existing models. And so what we found is that in the majority of situations, analysts developing prediction models should utilize those existing prediction models. There wasn't any penalty of doing so. It was particularly advantageous to do so when the data set that you have available to develop your model is particularly small. Okay, so you can see that in each of the panels, there's this sort of funneling effect for increasing sample size, where the de novo modeling from scratch converges to being suitable calibration slope. So this concept actually relates strongly to sample size considerations for prediction modeling. So this is slight tangent on the talk, but I think it's important to emphasize and just highlight. So Richard Riley and colleagues have recently published sample size criteria that allow analysts to say how much data, how many observations do I need in order to develop an accurate risk prediction model. And by accurate, I mean being able to estimate key parameters of interest and mitigate overfitting. And so these criteria are based on three main components. So the first is the type of model one wishes to fit. So is it a logistic regression model? Is it a linear model? Is it a time to event model? It's based on the anticipated performance, the predicted performance of those models, and also the number of predictors. Okay, so how many predictor variables do you want to include in your model? And that also informs the required sample size. Now, in terms of what I've just been describing in terms of model updating, it's that latter component that's of particular interest here, I think. Okay, so all of those model updating or model aggregation methods reduce the number of parameters that you need to estimate in the new data set. Okay, you're essentially leveraging all of the existing data that's being used to inform those existing prediction models. Okay, so you're reducing your parameter space. And so because the number of parameters has been reduced, therefore, according to these sample size criteria, the required sample size will also reduce, okay, as compared to just starting from scratch. And so this links quite nicely with that previous result that we found in the sense of you should only really consider starting from scratch if you have sufficient data available. Okay, so now I want to move on to a second area of interest, which is how we handle missing data in prediction modeling. So if we think about the analytical pipeline in which we develop a CPM, there's essentially three main steps. So the first is actually developing a model. So you have a data set, you fit the model or train the algorithm to that data set, depending on the type of outcome. And you then need to test its predictive performance. So once you've developed it, you move on to validation, which could be internal. So that means testing its performance in data similar to that which it was developed, or testing it externally, where you test it in, say, in a different country or a different population which it was developed. You might do that multiple times, so maybe several validation studies. You might do an impact assessment to see, does it actually make clinical, is it a clinical benefit to use this model? And if all that's a success, you might then ultimately move on to implementing such a model into the workflows of clinical practice. And so predictions are often seen in these three distinct phases or steps. Now, the question in the context of what I'm about to talk about is how we handle missing data at each stage of this process. And perhaps more importantly, how we handle missing data within each process, but also between the steps. Okay, and should there be consistency in how we handle that between these steps? And in the context of prognostic research or prognostic modeling, prediction modeling, this is an under-researched topic. So you might be wondering, well, Glen, missing data has been widely studied, and why is it of particular interest in prediction, and why should that be different to other statistical types of analysis? Well, if we think about the goal of many other studies, so it might be that you're interested in uncovering a causal effect or looking at an association, perhaps. What we're interested in is recovering an unbiased estimate of a certain parameter of interest. Okay, and their research has shown that, say, multiple imputation is particularly useful, and 9 out of 10 times would be the most appropriate step. But actually, in the context of prediction, we're not necessarily interested in recovering unbiased parameter estimates. Okay, and so the approach that we might take to handling missing data might be different. Another underappreciated issue, particularly in the context of prediction modeling, is that the missing data method, so the approach that we use to handle missing data, when we come to develop the model, may not match when the model is actually implemented in clinical practice. Okay, so if we come to develop and test a model using multiple imputation, oftentimes multiple imputation wouldn't be then used when we come to implement the model. Okay, and so our assessments of how well that model performs might be over-optimistic, or certainly might be different than what is actually being observed in practice when the model's being used. And that's an argument that we elaborate in more detail on it in that paper there. So this is Antonia. So Antonia is a PhD student that I work with who's investigating this topic of handling missing data in risk prediction. And what Antonia was particularly interested in to start a PhD was to look at this idea of consistency in how we handle missing data across those steps of the CPM pipeline. So Antonia did a review to try and summarize different combinations that have actually been used in practice. And so to do that, what she did is approached NICE, so the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, to essentially get a list of prediction models that have been recommended in national guidelines. And from that list of identified CPMs, Antonia then found the original development paper of that prediction model, and also a few validation papers of that prediction model. And from each of those steps and each of those papers, she extracted a number of things. But of particular interest was the approach of handling missing data, so the imputation strategy, essentially, across the development, validation, and implementation. What we were particularly interested in is this idea of consistency. So just to elaborate on exactly what I mean by that. So we define consistency as being when the imputation method, or the approach of handling the missing data used when developing or validating the model, was compatible with that used at the implementation stage. Where by compatibility, what I mean is that the validation approach accurately reflects the performance used at implementation. So one way of thinking about this is in the context of estimands. So the estimand that you're targeting at validation stage matches that at implementation in the context of predict performance. So just to give some examples of what would be consistent using our definition, would be that if the imputation method used at all of the different stages was the same. So if you use multiple imputation throughout all stages, that in our eyes would be consistent. So what Antonia found was that NICE outlines 23 prediction models that are used in guidelines, and I've listed these on the right here. So you can see some common candidates, so Q-risk that I've already mentioned, Framingham, Euroscore, Hasbled, etc. So 23 across a range of different clinical areas. What was particularly of interest to us is this result here. So this is a Sankey diagram showing the imputation method, or the method of handling missing data at each of the 3 stages. And what we found is that at development time, the most common way of handling it was, well, either to not report what they did, or when they did report it, it was complete case analysis, so essentially exclude anyone with missing data. But from there, you can then start to see that there's this divergence in then how it's being handled. So, for example, development might use complete case analysis, but then come to use multiple imputation at validation, and then use mean imputation when the model's being used. Okay, and you can see there's huge inconsistencies within this diagram. And this, to a large extent, is probably unsurprising because, as I say, guidance and a framework of how to do this in prediction context is lacking. Okay. I think what's perhaps the natural question to ask from this finding is, does it matter? Okay, so if we have this inconsistency, should we care? Does it affect predictive performance? If so, by how much? And so Antonio is currently leading on a simulation and real-world data example to investigate that question. Okay, and that will form part of her PhD. Okay, so the third topic I want to talk about is longitudinal data and particular challenges of informative observation, which links quite strongly, I think, with what I've just been mentioning with missing data. So commonly what happens when we're developing a prediction model is we use cross-sectional views of particular risk factor. So for example, we might use somebody's BMI that's measured today to predict their risk of cardiovascular disease. But actually, increasingly, a lot of these prediction models are developed using electronic healthcare records or routinely collected data, wherein we have access to repeated measures of predictor variables about an individual. But what previous studies have shown is that actually very few prediction models utilize that longitudinal information. And so a question of interest could be that, well, why is that? And what we're proposing is that there's perhaps a lack of clarity on the available methods in this space in a prediction context, and particularly for more applied researchers, tackling this literature can be quite a challenge. And so this is Lucy Bull. She's a final year PhD student working with me and others in Manchester on this concept of how to utilize longitudinal approaches in risk prediction modeling. And one of the early pieces of work that Lucy did was this review that was published just shy of a year ago that looked at identifying available methods that could handle longitudinal data in a risk prediction context, specifically with the aim of trying to provide clarity and some guidance around what methods are available and what methods are appropriate for different prediction tasks. And what Lucy found through that review is that there were essentially three main reasons or analytical aims of why you would want to incorporate longitudinal data into a prediction model. And speaking to a largely statistical audience, this is probably unsurprising to many of you, but the three methods or three aims were firstly to improve the model specification, so in other words, to improve parameter estimation, and also to allow updated predictions through time. So if I observe a new measure of someone's BMI, I can then update their predicted risk of CVD through time. The second theme or aim was to predict a true value of predictor at a pre-specified time. So this is more speaking to imputing a variable. So if we have historic measures of BMI, can I try and predict what my BMI is today and therefore predict my future cardiovascular disease, for example? Thirdly, or the third aim was to account for changes in a predictor over a historical time window. So in other words, is the rate of change of a given predictor variable predictive of outcome as well as the actual value of that predictor? So is my rate of change of BMI predictive of CVD risk, for instance? And these were the sort of three main buckets, if you like, of reasons that people were quoting in the methodological literature around why we want to do this. In terms of the methods that are available to utilize longitudinal information, Lucy identified 7 broad categories of such methods. Okay, so some of these categories include different variations of a method, but broadly speaking, there were 7 categories that I've listed there. Now, in the interest of time, I don't have time to go through each of them in detail. Refer to you to the paper for that. But I think what's of interest to say is that the choice of which you would use depends on a number of things that Lucy found. So the first was the volume and the type of longitudinal information. The second links with my previous slide, so how and why you want to make use of the longitudinal information. Third, what you already know about the repeated measures and their association with the outcome of interest. And fourthly, the number of type of variables that you'd want to model longitudinally. Okay, so just to give an example of that last point there, if you're fitting a joint model, for instance, which is really computationally intensive, if you've got lots of predictor variables that you want to model longitudinally, that approach might be less appealing from a computational point of view than some of the simpler alternatives. Okay, so just to give a flavor of that. And what Lucy's currently doing is exploring, again, a simulation to try and compare some of these approaches in terms of their respective benefits and disadvantages. Now, while methods are available to do this sort of thing in a prediction context, I think the idea of informative observation is particularly noteworthy in this field. So, as I said just a few moments ago, a lot of these prediction models are being developed using routinely collected or electronic health records, wherein the observation process is potentially informative of the outcome. So I think this paper nicely illustrates what I mean by that. So this paper that I'm citing here on the slide looked at electronic health records within an intensive care unit, where they explored how the timing of a particular lab test and the frequency of a particular lab test was associated with outcome. And what they found was that the timing of the lab test was associated with mortality, and the interval between observations was also associated with mortality. But really interestingly, both of those attributes were more predictive of mortality than the actual value of the lab test itself. So this is perhaps surprising when you first hear about it, but actually it kind of makes sense, right? So these attributes, so that the timing and the frequency of observation, is essentially acting as a proxy for clinical knowledge, right? So if clinical teams see that somebody is deteriorating on an ICU, for example, they're going to observe that patient more closely than somebody who's relatively stable. Another example could be, for example, in primary care. So we all only go and see our GP when we think that something's wrong with us. So if I look at my primary care record, the very fact that there's an observation about me probably tells you something about the underlying health state of the individuals. And so if we're modeling longitudinal data using routinely collected data to build predictive models, we need to think about this concept. And this is something that many people are looking at, but in our group, this is Rose, who's looking at this as part of her PhD. So Rose recently published a scoping review to try to summarize the methodology that could tackle these issues that I've been describing on the previous slide. And what Rose found is essentially that there are 3 categories of methods that would be available to do this. So the first is simply where you derive a predictor that tries to capture that observation pattern. So it could be that you include some sort of summary measure as a standard risk variable. So say, for instance, in a GP context, you might say, well, how many times has a given individual visited their GP within the last year, and feed that in as a predictor variable to predict outcome. The second was modeling under informed presence, as Rose called it. So this is essentially trying to account for the informative observation or presence, wherein you derive separate prediction models for each observation pattern. And the third type was what Rose called latent structures. So this covers things like hidden Markov models and joint modeling, wherein you have a joint model, say, across the observation process, the outcome process, and maybe some sort of latent state in that as well. And again, Rose is currently trying to look into comparing these to see which might be more advantageous or not, as the case might be. Okay, so now I want to shift focus slightly and look at something that's called penalization and shrinkage for prediction models. So what do I mean by that, and why would we consider penalization in prediction models? Well, essentially, whenever we fit any model using maximum likelihood, that suffers from small sample bias, in the sense that it is susceptible to picking up the nuances of a particular data set. So the coefficients are being estimated to be too extreme or overfit. And so penalization methods or shrinkage methods essentially introduce bias into the parameter estimation such that it shrinks those estimates towards zero to try and correct for that small sample bias from MLE. And there are two broad approaches to trying to do this. So the first is what we call post-estimation shrinkage, where we apply some uniform shrinkage factor to the MLEs, equation for those that are interested in the middle. And we estimate that shrinkage factor through bootstrapping or heuristic shrinkage factor formula. Okay, so that shrinkage factor is usually some number less than zero. You multiply that by all of the maximum likelihood estimates to pull them towards the null. The second approach might be more familiar, so that's penalized likelihood methods, essentially. So lasso and ridge or elastic net, where the degree of shrinkage or penalization is controlled by a tuning parameter or a hyperparameter, usually denoted lambda, which we estimate through cross-validation approaches normally. And both of those approaches, through that penalization, try and correct for this or mitigate against overfitting. And so they've been recommended in the literature when developing CPMs, particularly when the sample size is small. But because we're estimating those shrinkage factors and the penalization terms, they're obviously being estimated with uncertainty. And so this paper that I'm just showing on this slide here aimed to investigate the amount of uncertainty in those terms and the knock-on effect it has on predictive performance. Okay, and so Ben and colleagues performed a simulation study, where they varied the sample size and various other properties of the model, and looked at the degree of uncertainty or variability in the shrinkage factor or the penalization term or the tuning parameter. And what they found was that those shrinkage methods improved the level of overfitting on average. So on average, it was better to do some sort of penalization, regardless of which approach one takes. But what was quite shocking result from that paper is that the level of variability in that shrinkage meant that while it worked on average, there were situations where it really didn't work. And more importantly, it often didn't work when shrinkage was most often needed. So in other words, when the sample size was smallest, the shrinkage or penalization was performing worse, okay, which is the exact opposite of what you want, okay, based on the previous recommendation of using these methods in small samples. This was then studied a little bit further by Richard Riley and colleagues. So there they looked at variability, both as a function of the sample size that's available and also the level of required shrinkage. So this is just a screen grab of one of the figures from that paper, where we looked at essentially 3 cases. So one case where there was quite a large required shrinkage, all the way through to a case where there was no required shrinkage, so a shrinkage factor of 1 on the right-hand side here. And we also, on the x-axis of these figures, varied the number of participants used to derive the model. And what we can see from this figure is that the variability in the shrinkage factor, represented by the bars on each panel here, that variability increased both as a factor of n, the sample size, but also as the required shrinkage increased. Okay, again, the exact opposite of what you ideally want. We then also looked at then what happens as a result of that in terms of the predicted performance. Okay, and what we found is that as n decreased, there was larger variability in that tuning parameter, as I've just been outlining, but also then that had a knock-on effect on the predicted performance. So again, you can see that while all these methods are working on average in terms of minimizing overfitting, there's huge variability in those estimates. Okay. And so what we conclude in that paper is that penalization techniques are useful, but they're not a get out of jail free card, so to speak, for small sample sizes. Okay. So if you have insufficient data and you can base that on Richard's sample size criteria, that you can't simply apply LASSO to overcome that limitation. So recent work that I've looked at is essentially exploring this concept of if you're in if you have a data set that has minimum sample size, what's the level of variability that we might observe? Okay, and what we found is that, again, on average, all of the methods have resulted, all of the penalization methods, I should say, were well calibrated on average, and the penalization further reduced the level of overfitting. But this came at the cost of increased variability in the predicted performance. And so what myself and others are recommending, based on all of these papers that I've been referring to, is that this idea of exploring variability in tuning parameters and correspondingly predicted performance, that should form part of the development process. Okay, so we shouldn't just look at average performance from, say, Bootstrap internal validation. We should look at this scatter of performance as well, because it gives you a sense of how well are we going to expect this model to work in new data. Okay, so final few slides then, just on, again, a slightly different focus of mine, which is developing models for multiple outcomes, or multivariate prediction models. So the current state of play of prediction models is that they commonly focus on a single thing, a single outcome. So predict a model for cardiovascular disease. Another model might predict the risk of CKD, for example. And that situation is perfectly fine if we're only interested in the risk of one of those events happening, so that the marginal risk, irrespective of what might happen with the other outcomes. But if we think about how healthcare operates, there's a slight disconnect there between what clinical teams are interested in, which is a holistic view of somebody's health or likely prognosis, and that marginal risk. So just to give an example of that, so in patients with atrial fibrillation, or AF, the use of oral anticoagulants is constantly being balanced between the risk of that person or somebody having a stroke and the risk of bleeding. Okay, and there are many risk models that are able to estimate the risk of stroke, and there are many other models that are able to estimate the risk of bleeding. So CHAD2, BASC, and HAS-BLED, for example. But what we're interested in here, in this example, is the joint risk of stroke and bleeding happening simultaneously. And what's important to emphasize is that that's not necessarily the product of those two marginal risks, okay? And so there's a slight disconnect here between the existing models and the actual clinical interest. So when we're thinking about multiple models, it's useful to, multiple outcomes, sorry, it's useful to distinguish between the type of outcome. And what I'm interested in primarily is what I call multi-label outcomes. So this is where you're predicting across multiple possible events where the occurrence of one doesn't necessarily prevent the others from happening. So like that AF example. That contrasts a little bit to a subtly different type of outcome in terms of what I call multi-class outcome or polytomous outcome, where you might have different cancer stages, for example, or different types of tumor, for example, wherein the multiple possible outcomes prevent some of the others from happening. Okay, so all of what I'm about to talk about is primarily focused on the first of those, the multi-label outcome. So in the context of statistically speaking, there are many methods that would be available to us to model a multivariate outcome. Okay, and I don't need to tell this audience of why the importance of that is, but I think what is of interest is that these types of methods aren't commonly used in a prediction context. So the current state of play is that you'd essentially get one model to predict one of the outcomes, another model to predict the other outcome, and multiply those two risks together in order to try and get an estimate of the probability of them both happening. So for example, the probability of stroke and the probability of bleeding. Now, where this starts to break down in healthcare is that what happens to me in terms of one outcome is not independent of other outcomes that might happen to me, for example. Okay, so the risk of me having a bleed and stroke aren't necessarily independent to each other. And so this current approach of multiplying the marginal risks is not likely to work. And so what we need to use is some of these methods that account for the correlation between the potential outcomes. Okay, so there's a wealth of literature on this, as I say, for multivariate modeling, and I've just given a few examples here. I think what's missing is the application of these methods into models that are used for prediction, and particularly those that are implemented in clinical practice. And so what I'm currently leading on is a program of work that's trying to tackle this issue. Okay, and this is the first paper from that program of work where we're trying to say, well, how wrong can things go if we don't do the multivariate approach and we do this current approach of multiplying the marginal risks together. And so in short, and again, probably unsurprising to a statistical audience, but essentially the methods that rely on conditional independence, so this idea of multiplying the marginal risks, don't work as soon as you have the correlation between the outcomes. And they by don't work, what I mean is they lead to systematic under prediction of that joint risk. So to give an example of that, if we use that AF example, if we multiply the risk of bleeding from has bled by the risk of bleeding stroke from CHAD2 VAS, that will underestimate systematically the number of people that would experience both of those outcomes. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, the methods that model the multivariate outcome do provide an accurate estimate of that joint risk. And importantly, all of the methods that we considered in that paper have statistical software available to fit them. And so what's not 100% clear is why there is this disconnect between the methodological literature and the applied prediction literature. And what we're working on to try and tackle that is both the methodology to support its wider use, but also a range of guidance papers to try and aid applied researchers tapping into this space. Okay, so the multivariate literature is quite heavy statistically speaking, and so that might be contributing to the that gap. Okay, so just to conclude then, it's a range of different topics and high-level overview of each, but what I hope to articulate in the talk is that, well, three things. So firstly, that in my view, we should utilize all available information when developing the CPMs. And by that, I mean both existing models that have been published and possibly longitudinal data. But we should respect the fact that both of those things are a noisy representation of the truth. So we have the issues of missing data in the case of existing prediction models. And we also have this idea of informative observation when we're looking at longitudinal data. The second thing as a take-home message would be penalization methods are not a get-out-of-jail-free card for insufficient sample sizes, but they can be beneficial provided you satisfy minimal sample size requirements based on Richard Riley's work, for example. And finally, multiple outcomes should be considered more widely in prediction, particularly when we're interested in joint risk. But I do think there's a range of research questions that need addressing before that could be used more widely. So with that, I thank you all very much for your attention and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Glenn, for a fascinating talk, and I think that really highlighted all the nuances that you need to be aware of when you're developing these prediction models. As Glenn said, if you have a question, you can raise your hand or pop your question in the chat. Just to say also that Glenn has kindly agreed to stay on the call for a short while after the seminar. So if anyone would like a more informal chat after the formal seminar, then please do stay on, and Glenn is happy to do that. Okay, so I can see we have a question from Arthur Harvey. Arthur, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, or would you prefer me to read out from the chat?
Yes, I could do so. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Glenn. That was very informative and constructive. Thank you. I was just wondering as to what are your thoughts about how the Internet of Things and big data and the data from or the real-time data from our patients might help us solve the issue of missing data, and also how that would help us both improve our models and accurately predict the risk of potential problems.
Thanks, Arthur. That's a great question. So in short, I think these types of data sources, so Internet of Things, or even more broadly, sort of wearable tech or mobile devices, social media data, I think they have huge potential to help in a whole range of different research topics, prediction included. In terms of missing data, I think that the way it can help there is that you're not reliant on, for example, a patient visiting their GP to collect data. Okay, so these sort of remote monitoring type systems, or as I say, mobile devices, because they can collect data in real time on almost a 24/7 basis, that aspect of missing data is somewhat reduced, I think, because it can almost be used both to fill in the blanks, because we're seeing people between visits, say, but also it's potentially informative, right? Because you're getting really granular information about a patient and how they're living their life. And so I think that's then where it comes into your second question in terms of how it might improve prediction, because you're getting that granular information, you're able to feed that into the prediction model. Having said that, I think there are particular challenges with these types of data because they are so vast and because it is so large. How you appropriately capture that and feed it into a prediction model, and trying to predict from overfitting and all these sort of statistical properties, I think that's a really interesting area and not something that I think has been explored in much detail. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, I see you have a question. You want to unmute?
Thanks, Glenn, for a really interesting talk. I have a question about your first part of your talk regarding using existing models to either update a model that you want to use in practice for a particular population. One of the reasons why people tend to develop a new model is because they have other variables that they want to include, which aren't included in those existing models. What are your recommendations then in terms of how you develop that new model leveraging the information from the existing models?
That's a great question. Thanks. It's I think I totally agree with you that's often why people ignore it. Some of the stacked regression type approaches from Thomas DeBray would allow you to do that. So you can essentially use the data you have at hand, both to combine the existing models and then essentially add in new variables that might be of interest, and essentially just you add on to the weighted sum. So if you imagine all of the linear predictors forming covariates, you then add, say add age plus any other new variable that might be of interest. That's slightly more tricky in the meta-analysis type framework because you need a unified set of estimates to pool across, but it is possible in the more stacked regression based approaches.
Thanks.
Okay, there's a few questions in the chat. I think in the interest of time, I'll just read these out. So the first is from Peter Williams, which is, in processing all of these prediction models, have you been able to assess how researchers have addressed the zero cell count problem in logistic regression modeling?
Ooh, I must admit, Peter, I'm not too familiar with that literature, so the short answer is no. But I'd be happy to have a chat with you about that separately to see if we can find somewhere, but not something I'm an expert in, I'm sorry.
Okay, so the second is a comment from Gilbert Mackenzie. Generally, farmers and health researchers don't use routine data. The quality of routine data is often questionable. Yeah,
totally agree. And because it has all of these subtleties with it in terms of informative observation and the quality of the recording and how that varies across different practices, it's a bit of a minefield. I think it's particularly of interest in prediction because of the sample size and the scale at which the data's recorded and available. But yeah, totally agree. It is questionable.
And then from Claire Williams, great talk. I think you could learn much from the methodology applications in competing risk multi-state models for multivariate censored outcomes to your area of multivariate uncensored outcomes. I think I bungled the reading of that message a little bit, but is that a clear question?
It totally is. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so some of the work that we're doing in that space is looking at multi-state models where you have each state being one of the outcomes and then all the combinations of that. I think it's a really interesting avenue. So thanks for pointing that out.
And then from Stephen K. So in your experience, which is more of an issue in current CPMs, inappropriate coefficients, e.g. lack of shrinkage or accounting for interactions, or mostly just utilising the wrong baseline risk? I would guess the latter may be more relevant.
Yeah, again, great question. I think both are an issue in their own ways, I would say. So it's actually, I think as a field and as somebody working in this, it's often quite a challenge. So I was involved in a systematic review for COVID prediction models, where we looked at all of the models that have been developed in that and assessing the risk of bias. And reading some of those papers, it's, yeah, I mean, the methodological quality of some and the reporting of some is quite poor, and both the points you outlined there and others, there's a whole heap of things wrong with this, which is a bit of a sad state of affairs, I think.
Then there's a question from Catherine Parkin, a very helpful talk, thank you. So this is about sharing the slides. So Catherine, maybe you could email Glen privately about that. So I believe the talk is also being recorded, so it should be available on the website. And then a second comment from Gilbert Mackenzie. Even with one longitudinal model, usually modeling the covariance structure is ignored.
Yeah, again, totally agree, Gilbert. And yeah, it's a shame. I think that's partly what motivated some of Lucy's work in the sense that this literature on longitudinal modeling can be quite inaccessible at times because it's quite maths heavy in places, and all the subtleties that you need to pick up, like modeling the covariance structure and the error structure, can be overlooked. And so trying to tackle this with guidance papers or review papers, I think, well, hopefully it'll help.
Okay, and so this will be the final question, I think. So question from Daphne Zacharenia Kunali. Impute or not impute missing predictors such as ethnicity for individual predictions? Any views?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think there's a whole range of different variables, ethnicity included, where imputing it is perhaps questionable. So I mean, so in terms of the specific point about ethnicity, that leads into the whole field of fairness, I guess, in prediction models. And you know, if we're imputing based on a data set that has predominant certain ethnicity, certain groups might be underrepresented. I think it's a hugely complex issue, and yeah, totally agree that you need to carefully think about what you're imputing as well as how you're imputing and potentially why. As well, it links to the routinely collected data point as well. You know, the concept of missing data in routinely collected data doesn't actually exist in some sense, because you haven't got a scheduled observation pattern. So it's not clear whether you would expect to see an observation and it's missing, or it's missing because somebody hasn't been to see their GP, for example. Okay,
thank you, Glen, for answering that huge number of questions. I'd say there are a couple more, so I think we should close the formal seminar here as we are overrunning. But if you do have further questions, as I said, Glen is happy to stay on the call and have an informal chat. So please do stay if you'd like to ask further questions.